Killing police officers might be a thing of pride for certain gangsters and criminals, but in reality, it's perhaps the most unwise decisions that they can make. Murder is bad enough. Murder of a cop? With that, there's nowhere to hide. If you don't believe me, stay with me as I show you just why gangsters never kill cops, as well as what happens when gangsters are permitted to kill police officers. Gary Nelson. Killing police officers has two sides. On one hand, law enforcement officers do just about anything to find cop killers and bring them to justice. However, in the crime world, killing a police officer is used by gangsters to brag. And so when a psychopathic gangster killed police officer Patrick Dunn, he seemed only proud about it. He was unrepentant and defiant the entire way, and it seemed that this was his own great hubris. Born in 1969, Gary Nelson was one of Britain's most dangerous gangsters. Over the years, he's moved from petty crimes all the way to organized crime. He's well known for his violence and unpredictability. He had multiple run-ins with the law from when he was just a teenager, and as the years went on, he didn't seem interested in giving up his life of crime. Being a top gangster for one of London's most infamous crime families afforded him with certain luxuries. He was quite wealthy, in fact, and he spent a decent amount getting all sorts of expensive cars, clothes, jewelry, and even a high-end apartment in the fancy part of town. He also had a weird attraction and infatuation with guns, going as far as to call his Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol my special thing. In October of 1993, Nelson, then 24, tried to get into a nightclub. A security guard named William Kwame Danso had refused him entry. Now most people would have just gone on with their night and found something else to do, but Gary Nelson wasn't most people. Gary was petty and spiteful. He instead decided that the best plan of option was to take revenge on William. He tracked William home, and then he, together with two other accomplices, decided to kill William with a hail of bullets from his Browning semi-automatic and an Italian-made Tanfoglio self-loading pistol. Now it happened that Police Constable Patrick Dunn, a 44-year-old who had just 4 years prior been a math teacher, had been in the area responding to a domestic duty. When he heard the gunfire from the attack on William Danso, he rushed out to investigate what was going on. Unfortunately, he ran right into the path of Gary Nelson, who, with a single shot from his Tanfoglio to his chest, killed him. He and his crew then walked to a waiting getaway vehicle, laughing and even shooting a celebratory shot before getting in and driving off. 5 weeks later, Gary Nelson was arrested and charged with the murders, but the case could not stick, as there was a lack of evidence. The police could not get any direct witness to testify against Nelson, and they also didn't have the murder weapon with which to prove that he had been the one who had pulled the trigger. So even though they knew that he was the killer, they had to let him go. In fact, his own aunt, Rose Nelson, had tried to help police find the murder weapon by leading a group to search the Wandsworth Cemetery at night. She believed that he had hurried the murder weapons there, but they could not find the guns. 5 months later, though, the police received various anonymous phone calls directing them to where the guns were. The police officers were able to identify and dig up the guns, but they still didn't have enough evidence against Gary Nelson. Gary was by this time incarcerated on a different charge, but he continued to make himself a serious pain to prison mates and prison security. In 1999, he was finally released from jail, and he was soon back to his criminal ways. Apparently, not even prison could change him. In 2001, the murder case of Officer Dunn was reopened, partly because of pressure from his family, who wanted closure. A BBC Crime Watch appeal brought forward a former fellow inmate in Wormwood Scrubs who testified that Gary Nelson told him, "I shot that copper, the one on the bike." 2 years later, in 2003, police were investigating him for a different matter, and so they had his apartment bugged. This would lead to them discovering that he had possession of a firearm, a Browning 9mm, and would lead to a conviction of a life sentence. Still, though, this was not enough, and the police needed to secure the conviction for the murder of PC Dunn. Detectives traveled to Ghana to find Eugene Jaba, manager of the shop where William Danso had worked. He testified via video link about seeing Gary pull a gun from his jacket the day before the murders and threatened to put a bullet in the belly of another man. The description he gave matched the Tanfoglio. With the evidence they had gathered, Gary Nelson was finally charged again for the murders of William Kwame Danso and PC Patrick Dunn over a decade after he had committed the murders. The case against Gary was mostly circumstantial, and the prosecution knew it had a hill to climb in order to prove to the court that he was responsible for the murders. A key part of this was presenting evidence of bad character. The aim of the prosecution was to show that over the years, Gary had been a menace to society, and so it was not out of the ordinary for him to have committed the murders. The jury listened to details of his previous convictions, including an occasion on which he opened fire on a man who overtook his car. He was eventually convicted of the murders and sentenced to 35 years in prison, to be served concurrently with his life sentence. On the day of his sentencing, he refused to leave his cell in Belmarsh prison to hear the verdict. Police suspect that Gary Nelson is responsible for many other murders, and they were glad he was finally taken off the streets permanently. Detective Chief Inspector Steve Richardson, who led the investigation against him, said, "He is undoubtedly one of the most dangerous men in the country, and it is to be hoped he is never released." John Herbert Dillinger. John Herbert Dillinger, born on the 22nd of June, 1903, in the Oak Hill section of Indianapolis, is one of the most infamous gangsters who operated during the Great Depression. He was a notorious robber and the leader of the Dillinger Gang. He was one of the FBI's most wanted persons at the time, and understandably so. He was a constant pain to law enforcement, and he even managed to escape imprisonment twice. There were very few people that the government wanted put away at the time as much as they wanted Dillinger put away. Unfortunately, John Dillinger's story ended rather tragically. I'll tell you how. Like many criminals, John Dillinger started to show signs of delinquency from a young age. Perhaps his family's dysfunction was a factor in this, as after the death of his mother, John extremely disliked his stepmother. He kept getting in a lot of trouble until eventually he just quit school altogether and decided to get a job in a machine shop. However, not even a stable job could keep young John grounded, and soon he started to run wild. Even his father's attempt to calm him by moving from Indianapolis to the relatively remote Mooresville didn't seem to help. Things seemed like they could be looking up for him when he enlisted to join the Navy, but no sooner had he joined than he deserted. He returned to Mooresville and then moved back to Indianapolis with his new bride, Beryl Hovius, in 1924. However, getting a job was a lot harder this time, and soon he met a local pool shark, Ed Singleton. Together, they planned to rob a grocer in Mooresville. The robbery didn't go as planned, and they were apprehended. They were convicted, but while Ed Singleton got a 2-year sentence, John got handed joint sentences of 2 to 14 years and 10 to 20 years in the Indiana State Prison. By the time he got out of prison, 8.5 years into his sentence, he was hardened. Almost immediately, Dillinger robbed a bank in Bluffton, Ohio. Again, he was arrested by the police and held in the county jail in Lima, Ohio, awaiting trial. The Lima police found in his possession plans for a prison break, but he denied knowledge of it. 4 days later, using the same plans, 8 of his friends escaped from the Indiana State Prison using shotguns and rifles that had been smuggled into their cells. A couple of weeks after the prison escape, 4 of the former inmates from the Indiana State Prison went to Lima, pretending to be law enforcement and claiming that they were trying to return John to the Indiana State Prison for violation of his parole. Things went south when the sheriff demanded to see their credentials, and so the men decided to go the violent way and shot the sheriff, and then freed John. The sheriff died. The 4 men involved in the jailbreak were identified as Harry Pierpont, Russell Clark, Charles Makeley, and Harry Copeland. All of them, and John Dillinger as well, were declared wanted men. With his newfound freedom, John Dillinger continued to rob several banks and police stations. In January of 1934, the Dillinger gang killed a police officer during the robbery of the First National Bank of East Chicago, Indiana. This was perhaps one of the biggest mistakes that John Dillinger and his gang made. They went to Arizona trying to stay undercover, but they were arrested. John was brought back to Indianapolis to stand trial for the murder of the police officer his gang had killed in East Chicago. He was kept in a secure jail, but even there he managed to overcome the guards with what was apparently a wooden gun that had been smuggled in. The guards didn't know it was made of wood, and they followed his instructions and let him out. For the second time in his life, he had escaped from jail. At this point, the FBI got involved in the manhunt for him and other members of his gang. John moved to St. Paul with his girlfriend, a woman named Evelyn Frechette. There, they continued to rob banks. After a run-in with the FBI, they moved back to Mooresville, Indiana. When Miss Frechette got arrested in Chicago, John moved to Michigan for a while and then to Wisconsin. Then one day things all changed. A woman in Gary, Indiana, who called herself Anna Sage, but was really named Anna Kumpanus, contacted the FBI claiming that she had information that could lead to the arrest of John Dillinger. In return, she wanted a cash reward and help from getting deported, as she was an illegal alien on American soil. She informed them that a friend of hers, a woman named Polly Hamilton, had befriended John, and that they were planning to go see a movie at the theater the next day. On the 22nd of July, 1934, Anna Sage, John Dillinger, and Polly Hamilton walked into the Biograph Theater. By the time they were leaving the theater at around 10:30 p.m., they were surrounded by a host of FBI agents. Dillinger decided that he would not go easy and grabbed a pistol from his right trouser pocket as he ran toward the alley, trying to escape. As he ran, the agents shot at him. Of the 5 shots fired from the guns of 3 FBI agents, 3 hit Dillinger, and he fell face down on the pavement. He was pronounced dead soon after at the Alexian Brothers Hospital. The death of John Dillinger was ruled as justifiable homicide, and the agents who shot at him were all commended by J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI at the time, for fearlessness and courageous action. John Dillinger was buried in Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, Indiana. El Salvador. El Salvador has historically been one of the roughest places to live. The rate of violent crimes made it one of the least considered destinations for anyone for decades. Gangs ran the streets and controlled entire regions with impunity. These gangs trace their origins back to the United States. They were formed by Salvadoran immigrants who had fled the country during its civil war in the 1980s. More than 330,000 Salvadorans came to the U.S. between 1985 and 1990, according to the Migration Policy Institute. A huge percentage of that amount went to Los Angeles. It was in Los Angeles that many of the gangs originated. In the 1990s, however, U.S. immigration authorities deported large numbers of gang members back to their home countries, and so the gangs were basically replanted in El Salvador. The most popular of these gangs are the Mara Salvatrucha, also called MS-13, and their fiercest rivals, the 18th Street. There are a few other gangs, with each fighting for dominance and control. These gangs have been known to be extremely violent and had no regard for anyone or any form of authority. Murder, drug trafficking, and extortion are crimes they are most known for. Anyone who stands in their way is simply eliminated, whether you were a civilian, a politician, or even a police officer. For years, El Salvador struggled to keep this gang problem under control. There seemed to be a breakthrough when the 2012 to 2014 Salvadoran gang truce, facilitated by the government, the Catholic Church, and the leaderships of the two biggest gangs, drastically reduced the violence on the streets. However, this peace was very short-lived, and soon the violence was back in full force again. Poverty has always been a factor in the widespread gang activity in El Salvador, as the gangs prey on vulnerable, poor people, mostly men with promises of money and power. One major issue that the government faced was that the country's police and armed forces seemed almost powerless against the gangs. Police officers who refused to be corrupted or who tried to stop the gangs from operating were simply killed. It was clear that a very deep restructuring needed to be done to save El Salvador from the clutches of control by gangs. So when the vibrant, idealistic president Nayib Armando Bukele Ortez was elected into power on the 1st of June 2019, many people expected changes. Boy, did they get changes. Even before he got into power, while he was still campaigning for office, Bukele made it clear that if elected, he would be tough on crime, especially corruption and gang activity. He claimed that he would use the mano dura, also known as the iron fist method, and that the safety of the citizens will be his primary objective. So when he started to crack down on criminal activity soon after getting in, no one was particularly shocked. Bukele became president in 2019 in democratic elections. Founding the political party Nuevas Ideas, he ran an anti-corruption campaign in which he promised to reduce crime. He preached the mano dura political tactic, where he decided to place the safety of his citizens as the #1 priority. For the first couple of years of his presidency, President Bukele was not as radical in dealing with this problem. It wasn't until 2022 when the gangs went on a wild, violent spree in a bid to wring concessions from the government. Citizens and law enforcement were targeted. It wasn't unusual for police officers to be targeted by gangs. Over the years, hundreds of police officers had been attacked by gangs. It simply made sense for gangs to eliminate law enforcement to make operating easier. However, this time the case was different. The El Salvadorian government was tired of police officers and citizens being used as victims. Something had to change. President Bukele struck back, and he struck hard. He used the full force of the police and military to clamp down hard on gangs. He instituted a state of exception, in which suspected gangsters who have been arrested without warrants can be imprisoned without trial. He also created a mega prison specifically to hold gang members. His policies were tough, but surprisingly popular. El Salvadorians mostly speak highly of him. In fact, in a recent poll, his approval rating exceeded 90%, and it's not just the Salvadorians that respect him. The Honduran government also launched its own state of exception in November 2022, and over the past 5 months has extended and expanded it. A Guatemalan presidential candidate has also praised El Salvador's crackdown as a model to replicate. All through Latin America, many people approve of President Bukele's radical approach to dealing with El Salvador's gangs. However, international organizations like the Human Rights Watch criticize the measures used by the Bukele administration. They claim that the conditions that the prisoners are kept in are inhumane and a gross violation of their human rights. However, even with the massive stride that the El Salvador government has made, the gangs have not been completely eradicated. They continue to try to defy the government. In May of 2023, a police officer was killed by gang members, leading to the deployment of thousands of soldiers and police officers to the northern town of Nueva Concepcion. The police say the officer was killed when gang members attacked him and other officers while on patrol. Just like previous raids in other parts of the country, the military hopes to not only apprehend the gang members responsible for the murder, but to completely dismantle the gang's structures in Nueva Concepcion. It is certain that a lot of arrests will be made. President Nayib Bukele tweeted this about the situation. "They will pay dearly for the murder of our hero. We are in search of those responsible for the homicide side, and the entire gang structure and collaborators who are still hiding in that place. The steps taken by the current administration have certainly been controversial. However, the majority of Salvadorans seem willing to accept this, and who can blame them? The streets are safer, crime is down, and their families are no longer constantly harassed, extorted, and killed by these gangsters. To them, President Bukele is simply doing what needs to be done. Vikas Dube: cop killers don't always have the luxury of living to tell the tale. This fact alone is a big reason most people aren't daring enough to attempt attacking or killing a police officer. However, Vikas Dube isn't most people, and the guts of this Indian gangster and politician led to his eventual death. Vikas was born on the 26th of December 1964 to a Brahmin family in Bikru village in Kanpur Nagar district, Uttar Pradesh, India. His life of gangsterism started when he was quite young. He formed a local gang and was a general menace to society. He was involved in all sorts of criminal activities, from extortion to land grabbing and even murder. He particularly preferred to target people for land grabbing as he perceived them to be easy targets. Since he had a lot of muscle behind him, he very easily intimidated locals. He was nicknamed Vikas Pandit after the character of the 1999 film Arjun Pandit. He also liked to be called Pandit G. Vikas quickly became one of the most notorious and one of the most wanted criminals in Kanpur. In 1990, the first case was lodged against him. It was for murder. However, it didn't stick. Many people claimed that the reason for this was because of the political power he wielded. You see, Vikas wasn't interested in just money from crime. He also had quite the appetite for power. And what better way to get power than through politics? As you'd probably expect, his type of politics wasn't exactly ideal. He used a lot of violence and a lot of intimidation to gain political power. He had to start from somewhere, though, and he started by becoming a close ally of Harikishan Srivastava, a local politician. Srivastava was a member of the Bharatiya Janata Party, but then moved to the Bahujan Samaj Party. As his close associate, Vikas also joined the BSP in 1995. He contested for a position at the district level and won. Of course, this was done through intimidation of the people. In fact, he also used this tactic to get his wife, Richa Dube, to win local elections too. Vikas Dube was not one to allow any form of opposition. However, he knew one way to operate, violently, and he followed that code exclusively. In 2001, he was arrested and accused for the murder of BJP leader Santosh Shukla. Santosh was a minister of state at the time. However, even though it seemed like justice would be served, he was discharged for the murder. This was probably as a result of his political influence. For the next 2 decades, Vikas continued to criminally control his district. It all seemed like things were going well for him, until one day he went too far. On the 3rd of July 2020, policemen attempted to arrest Vikas and his men. Vikas had no plans to go to prison, and so he decided to escape. He and his goons got into a heated gun battle with the police, during which 8 policemen were killed, including a deputy superintendent of police. 7 police personnel were also injured. 2 of Vikas's gunmen, an uncle of Vikas, and another of his close relatives were also killed in the gunfight. Vikas himself had escaped. An autopsy report revealed that the DSP, a man named Devendra Mishra, had been beheaded and brutalized with an axe, while the other policeman had multiple bullet wounds. This suggested to the investigators that the officers had been ambushed by Vikas and his men. The police later recovered weapons suspected to have been used in the attack on the officers, which included an AK-47 rifle and an INSIS rifle, among others. The investigators also discovered that Vikas had been tipped off by police officers of his impending arrest, which gave him time to gather about 60 members of his gang to ambush the arresting officers as they approached his hideout. The police then started an all-out manhunt for Vikas Dube. They wanted nothing more than to bring him to justice, especially as he had killed so many police officers. A few days later, he was arrested at the Mahakaleshwar Jyotirlinga temple, located in the ancient city of Ujjain in the state of Madhya Pradesh. As he was being brought back to Kanpur by a team of special task force of the Uttar Pradesh police, the vehicle that he was being transported with suddenly skidded and had an accident. Rains had been heavy and the road was quite slippery. According to police, Vikas tried to take advantage of the situation and grabbed a gun from a police officer. He tried to escape with the gun, and as he ran, he was shot down. According to Uttar Pradesh Additional Director General of Police, Prashant Kumar, the special task force Jawans traveling in the other vehicle challenged him and asked him to surrender, but he opened fire. The cops fired in self-defense. Vikas suffered bullet injuries in the shootout and was rushed to the hospital, where the doctors declared him brought dead. He added that 4 of the STF Jawans were also injured in the encounter. His family members claimed that they had no information about the killing and only found out through the media. Following suspicions from the public and media about the circumstances surrounding the death of Vikas Dube, a judicial panel was set up. This was because there were claims that the encounter that had ended up in his death was a setup by the police. The panel reported that there was no material evidence against the Uttar Pradesh police in the killing of Vikas Dube. It claimed that it would have been different if the public, the media, and the criminal's family had come forward with proof. Enrique Kiki Camarena. DEA Special Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena is one of the most well-known and important figures of the United States war on crime. Kiki was born on July 26, 1947, in the small town of Mexicali, close to the Mexican border with the U.S. In 1956, when he was just 9 years old, his family moved to Calexico, California. He lived the rest of his childhood in Calexico till he graduated from high school. After high school, he chose to join the U.S. Marine Corps. He was an efficient and reliable soldier and was a stickler for following the rules. He served in the Marines till 1970 when he was discharged. After his discharge, he returned to Calexico. In Calexico, he worked for the town's fire department. In 1970, he transferred to the Calexico Police Department and was stationed in El Centro. There, he worked as a special agent on the Imperial County Narcotic Task Force, or ICNTF. This is where his work in drug law enforcement started. At the time Kiki Camarena got into law enforcement, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, had just been established. It was tasked with dealing with and handling any and every drug-related case. Kiki wanted to make a big difference in law enforcement, and so he and his sister Myrna joined the agency in 1973 as one of the agency's first Spanish-speaking agents. He started working as a special agent at the DEA's Calexico resident office in 1974. In 1977, he transferred to the agency's Fresno field office. Kiki Camarena was good at his job. He was very good. He was able to effortlessly infiltrate through the circles of drug dealers without raising any suspicion. His ability to blend in was something that the agency appreciated, and soon he was one of the top intelligence officers in the DEA. In 1980, Kiki was transferred to the DEA resident office in Guadalajara. Because U.S. law restricts agents from acting directly abroad, his job was to gather as much intelligence as possible on drug cartels in the area. That data would then be passed on to the local and federal law enforcement, and it would be up to them to act on the intelligence. This meant that the DEA needed to liaise with and maintain a good relationship with Mexican law enforcement. Kiki received data from an informant about the presence of a 200-acre-long plantation known as Rancho Buffalo, on which narcotics were being grown. The plantation allegedly made up to $8 billion annually and was owned by Guadalajara cartel member Juan Jose Esparragoza Moreno. In August of 1982, he found and confirmed the location of the plantation by flying over it. He then briefed the Mexican authorities, who raided and destroyed the plantation a month later. It was the largest plantation discovery at the time. Almost 3 years after the raid of Rancho Buffalo, on the 7th of February 1985, Kiki Camarena was abducted by members of the Guadalajara cartel. Over a 30-hour period, he was tortured and then murdered. It was clear that he was killed for his role in the crackdown on the plantation. It would turn out that the murder of Kiki Camarena was a big error by the Guadalajara cartel. Following the death of Kiki Camarena, the U.S. government commenced Operation Leyenda, which remains the largest homicide investigation the DEA has ever embarked on till date. Leyenda's goal was to bring those responsible for his kidnapping and death to justice. Investigators soon identified 3 primary suspects linked to the crime: Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero. Once they had been identified, the U.S. government put pressure on the Mexican government for their arrests, leading to the eventual apprehension of Carrillo and Quintero. Due to political protection, Angel Felix Gallardo did not get arrested along with his accomplices. The U.S. government also found the doctor who participated in the torture of Kiki and arrested him. His name was Humberto Alvarez Machain. He was brought into the United States by bounty hunters. Several Mexican government officials were implicated in the investigation, including the former director of Mexican Federal Judicial Police, Manuel Ibarra Herrera, and Miguel Aldana Ibarra, the former director of Interpol in Mexico. The more investigators pried, the more they discovered just how much the cartel had rooted themselves in the government and law enforcement. This went from members of the Jalisco State Police to local politicians and legislators. The U.S. government then discovered just how much work it had to do in its war on drugs. This inspired it to empower the DEA more. The U.S. now had the boldness to venture into foreign countries, including Mexico, in its aim of doing all it could to stop the trafficking of drugs into its territory. This was evident through the provisions of laws like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which approved funding for the fight against drug trafficking, increased international regulations in regard to drugs, and expanded enforcement and prevention methods. It also allowed the U.S. to withhold resources from foreign foreign countries that hadn't put in the effort to stop drug and money laundering related affairs within their own country. Through withholding resources, the U.S. was able to pressure countries such as Mexico to cooperate with the DEA. The Office for Substance Abuse Prevention was also established, giving even more funding to the DEA. The DEA was now even stronger than it had been before Kiki Camarena's death. Kiki Camarena posthumously received the Administrator's Award of Honor, the highest award given by the agency. He was also featured on Time magazine in November of 1988. A school, a library, and a street in his hometown of Calexico are named after him. In 2004, the Calexico Police Department erected a memorial dedicated to Camarena in the halls of the department where Camarena served. In the same year, the Enrique S. Camarena Foundation was established. Kiki Camarena's wife, Mika, and son Enrique Jr. serve on the all-volunteer board of directors together with former DEA agents and law enforcement personnel. If you found the details of this video intriguing, click on one of the recommendations on your screen right now for more.